Hey friends, tonight, let's explore why medieval people looked at frogs, slimy bug-eyed, surprisingly loud frogs, and thought romance. You're in a cramped, herb-scented room, with a low ceiling and even lower expectations. The walls are lined with bundles of dried plants, most of which look like they've seen better centuries. On a crooked wooden table lies a small vial sealed with wax and tied with a bit of twine. Inside, something dark, something slightly shriveled, something that used to croak. Welcome to the love potion economy of the Middle Ages. Before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content here. And if you're listening from somewhere humid and full of crickets, like a swamp-side cabin or a cozy apartment in Florida, drop your local time and location in the comments. I'd love to know when and where we're dreaming together. Turn down the lights, perhaps start a fan to create a soothing ambiance, and join me as we slowly dive into tonight's story. The apothecary doesn't flinch as he wraps the vial in rough cloth. He's seen weirder. Love potions were always his best sellers, second only to anti-plague amulets made of onion and regret. But this one's for a nobleman's daughter, pale as a parchment and twice as dramatic. She believes she's in love, or cursed, possibly both. And she's been told the cure lies in amphibian anatomy. Tonight's historical fact: in parts of medieval Europe, frog bits, especially dried hearts or legs, were commonly used in so-called love charms and attraction spells. Some were worn in little pouches around the neck. Others were steeped in wine, tied under beds, or if you were feeling especially bold, slipped into someone's food. Nothing says romance like sneaking a frog leg into someone's stew and whispering hope to the moon. The logic frogs were seen as creatures of transformation. They went from egg to tadpole to leggy jumper, and in a world where change was rare and terrifying, that made them magical. People believed that by harnessing their essence, they could change fate hearts and sometimes underwhelming courtship prospects. You shift your weight on the straw mat, watching a young apprentice at the back of the room scribbling something on parchment. Likely another recipe involving questionable ethics and even more questionable science. But back then, science was flexible. If it smelled weird and made you sneeze, it was probably effective. Now for tonight's oddity. Some recipes insisted the frog be collected at a crossroads during a full moon while singing a hymn backward. No, really. The logic crossroads were liminal spaces where worlds-touch decisions were made, and occasionally someone dropped a perfectly good toad for magical convenience. You walk outside with the apothecary as he hands off the potion to a cloaked messenger. The air is thick with dampness, and somewhere a frog calls out into the night. It sounds less like love and more like indigestion, but the symbolism is strong. And really, that's half of medieval medicine: symbolism, wishful thinking, and a whole lot of herbs no one could identify. But not everyone believed in the power of frogs. Some theologians argued that love was divine, not chemical or amphibian. There were entire debates in university halls about whether tampering with affection was heretical. Could true love be induced with a boiled creature from the ditch behind your house? Or were you simply dooming yourself to an eternity of guilt and green-tinged hallucinations? The academic consensus: murky, like most ponds. You pass by a small tavern where someone is already drunkenly insisting that his ex-wife must have used frog magic on him. The bartender nods sympathetically and pours more ale. Whether it's real or not, The belief in frog potions gave people something powerful, a sense of agency. When you lived in a world where your parents chose your spouse and romance was often just a tax agreement, with nicer clothes being able to stir your fate with a spoon felt hopeful. Now picture a medieval teenager, awkward acne-prone, because soap was a rumor, and hopelessly enamored with someone who didn't know their name. What did they do? Write poetry? Maybe. More likely, they bought a dried frog heart and tucked it under their pillow, hoping for a dream visit from the object of their affection. It was cheaper than flowers and didn't wilt. You sit by a nearby pond now, moonlight glinting on the water's surface. A frog croaks again, this time closer. You wonder what it's saying. Is it longing? Complaint? A weather update? In medieval minds, it might have been a whisper from the heart. Let's be honest, frogs weren't charming. They smelled like damp leaves and sounded like broken instruments. But they were everywhere. In ditches, in wells and beds if you were unlucky. And in the mind of a love-struck peasant, they were affordable miracles. And yes, some people got sick from love potions. Because let's face it, medieval love potions were basically a wellness smoothie made by someone who'd failed both biology and cooking. But that never stopped anyone. Love was worth the risk, even if it involved amphibians. So next time you hear a frog croak in the night, remember, in another century, that sound might have meant hope, or scandal, or just a particularly determined apothecary trying to make rent. And now sleep. May your dreams be potion-free and your ponds peaceful. Fun fact before we drift off, frogs were also believed to help predict storms and marriages sometimes in the same breath. Also, don't try medieval recipes at home, especially the one that starts with first charm, the frog with a lullaby. And if your true love ever gives you a vial of frog parts, consider couples therapy first. The kiss before the cure. You're crouched beside a shallow pond, just beyond the village edge, the kind of place where the air always smells faintly of mud moss and mystery. Fireflies blink lazily overhead, like the pond's own mood lighting, and somewhere off to your left, something with webbed feet plops into the water, with the elegance of a dropped turnip. It's not quiet. The frogs are holding court tonight, each one trying to outcroak the other, like a group of opinionated uncles after 2 ales. And sitting across from you, nose wrinkled and lips pursed in dramatic hesitation, is a young noblewoman holding a frog in her hands. She's going to kiss it, and not for the reasons you think. Tonight's historical fact in various pockets of medieval folklore, kissing a frog, wasn't just about fairy tales and princely transformations. No. In certain folk remedies, especially those tied to love fertility or mysterious illnesses, the act of physically interacting with a frog, holding it breathing near it, or yes, kissing it, was believed to transfer or cleanse emotional afflictions. Essentially, if your heart hurts, smooch something that doesn't care. The girl holds the frog aloft with the seriousness of a knight raising a sword. Around her neck hangs a charm bag filled with rosemary thistle and a single strand of someone else's hair. Don't ask how she got it. She believes this ritual will cure her of unreciprocated longing, a condition she read about in her aunt's love almanac. You might laugh gently, but you're not here to mock. You're here to observe and maybe, just maybe, understand. Because this frog, slightly lumpy and looking deeply unimpressed, is now the stand-in for centuries of longing superstition and very awkward romances. And here's the quirky detail of the night In some parts of Eastern Europe and rural Britain, a frog kiss was believed to reveal your future spouse. Not literally transform the frog. This isn't theater, but rather induce a dream or vision within the week of someone destined to break your heart less than average. Of course, there were rules. It had to be the first frog you saw after sundown. You had to fast for a day, and preferably do it under a waxing moon while wearing something green. You know, just your average Thursday prep. The girl closes her eyes. The frog sighs as much as frogs can, and then smooch. It's anticlimactic. There's no sparkle, no trumpet fanfare. Just a soft squish, a squeal, and the immediate need to rinse. She places the frog back on a lily pad and whispers a thank you as if it were a very confused therapist. You both sit there in silence for a while, listening to the chirping night and the occasional splash. It's oddly peaceful. The frog hops once, twice, then vanishes into the reeds like a green, warty ghost. Now here's where things get scholarly. Medieval physicians, and we use the term physician loosely, as some were also bakers, and part-time exorcists often debated the link between emotion and disease. Melancholy, for example, could be cured by redirecting humors. And what better vessel for your excess longing than a creature that lived between worlds, land and water earth, and spirit appetite and apathy? The frog was transformation incarnate. Unpredictable, slightly damp, just like love. Some texts even suggested you whisper the name of your beloved to the frog before releasing it, believing the frog would carry the message to the gods of union, or at least hop in their general direction. You shift your position, feeling the cool grass press against your palms. The girl leaves a small posy of herbs near the water's edge. It's part offering, part apology. You suspect she'll return tomorrow, hoping for a dream or an omen, or even just a nice breeze from the right direction. Back in the village, people will gossip. They always do. Someone will say they saw her near the pond. Someone else will swear she's been cursed, or that her kiss made the frogs sing in Latin. The truth is less dramatic, but far more human. She just wanted to feel like she could do something about her aching chest. Because in a world where women often had little say in who they married, kissed, or even sat beside kissing a frog, voluntarily was a radical act of autonomy, a tiny rebellion dressed in superstition and slime. And as the night thickens around you, stars flickering into place, you wonder how many other kisses have been whispered into amphibian skin. How many hopes launched like paper boats across the surface of uncertain ponds. Not all were answered. Most probably weren't. But the act itself mattered. The ritual, the intention. So when someone laughs at an old folk tale about frogs and kisses, you can smile softly and say it wasn't always about magic. Sometimes it was about being heard by something, anything, when no one else was listening. Now drift off with this image, a frog on a lily pad, blinking at the stars like it knows a secret. And maybe in some forgotten corner of a medieval field it did. A few soft chuckles before you close your eyes. Medieval heartbreak was real, but at least frogs were cheaper than therapy. No frogs were permanently emotionally damaged in the making of these potions. If your modern love life feels complicated, at least it doesn't involve kissing things that eat bugs for fun. Hopefully. Warts and whispers. You're sitting on a stone fence, the kind that's just tall enough to be inconvenient and just wide enough to tempt you to balance on it anyway. The stones are cold beneath you, dusted with moss and rumors. Behind you, The sun is melting into the hills like a candle no one asked to be lit in the first place. And ahead of you, a group of village children chasing frogs like they're made of candy and scandal. One of them yells, "Don't touch it, you'll get warts." The others freeze. A small green frog, barely the size of a thumbprint, blinks from the grass like it's been personally insulted. Tonight's historical fact in medieval Europe: it was widely believed that handling frogs, or toads, would give you warts. This wasn't based on science. It was based on observation, superstition, and probably a lot of squirming. The bumpy texture of many frogs, especially toads, looked suspiciously like the skin conditions people already didn't understand. So naturally, the frog got blamed. But here's the twist. While frogs were shunned by some for being wart delivery systems, they were also prized by others for the exact opposite reason. That's right. Some folk healers believed that rubbing a frog on your skin could actually remove warts, preferably at night, preferably in silence, preferably while reciting a rhyme that involved the moon, your birth date, and possibly your neighbor's cat. So which was it, frog as the cause, or frog as the cure? You watch as an old woman, clearly someone's grandmother, and almost certainly a legend, steps forward and scoops up the frog with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy relics or a particularly good loaf of bread. She holds it gently in both hands and mumbles something into its non-existent ear. The children go quiet, respectful. This isn't just a frog now. This is a message, a whisper between worlds. Here's tonight's curious detail. There were rituals where a person would whisper their secret wish into the ear of a frog and then release it into the wild, believing the frog would carry that wish like an amphibious telegram to whatever spirit or force might be listening. Often it wasn't love or wealth they asked for. It was health, relief, forgiveness, or simply an answer. You hop down from the fence following the old woman as she walks slowly toward a well at the edge of the village. The frog still in her hands, she lowers it close to the water, says one last word, and lets it go. It plops into the dark and vanishes like it was never there. Academic debate time. Scholars argue over whether these beliefs were part of pagan survival Christian reinterpretation, or just what happens when people don't have dermatologists. Some suggest the frog rituals were remnants of older fertility cults. Others claim they were invented by traveling peddlers who needed something weird to sell. One thing's for sure, people took it seriously. Even in court records, you find cases of villagers accused of witchcraft for keeping too many frogs. One woman in 1372 was brought before a local tribunal with 7 frogs, a jar of goat fat, and a poem written backward. The court was confused. So was she. So were the frogs. But none of this felt silly back then. When you live in a world where illness has no name and sadness is something you carry like a physical weight, frogs become more than frogs. They're messengers, scapegoats, healers, symbols. You pass a tiny chapel and notice a carving over the door. It's worn by rain and time, but the shape's familiar, a frog curled like a sleeping cat. Not common in church art, but not unheard of either. Some local saints were believed to have used frogs as warning signs, or even allegedly choir members. Yes, choir frogs. Don't overthink it. As night rolls in, you return to your fence spot, the stone now chilled and humming with memory. The children are gone, the old woman too. Only the frogs remain, their voices rising like 1,000 tiny bells calling bedtime across the grass. You listen. Maybe you whisper something too. A thought, a hope, a name, just in case. And if someone ever tells you frogs are just wet animals that croak and look like leftover dough, remind them that for centuries they were part of magic medicine and meaning, all wrapped up in a green, blinky package with legs. 3 soft chuckles to send you off. If frogs really caused warts, medieval kids would have looked like walking turnips. Whispering to frogs is free. Therapy not so much. No frogs were harmed, though several are now emotionally burdened by centuries of human secrets. The Frog Bride Recipe. The kitchen smells like summer regret and boiled something. You're standing in the corner, tucked between a bundle of drying onions and a basket of lumpy apples that look like they gave up halfway through becoming fruit. In front of you, hunched over a clay mixing bowl, is a woman in her 40s with the posture of someone who's been in love 3 too many times and now trusts only recipes. She's making a marriage potion. Not just any potion, the Frog Bride recipe. Tonight's historical fact: in parts of medieval Europe, there existed documented bridal potions meant to either encourage a marriage proposal or ensure the loyalty of a new spouse. And yes, frog parts, particularly skin tongue, or occasionally the whole dried creature, were not uncommon ingredients, especially when combined with other items like crushed herbs, petals from flowers stolen from a rival's garden, and a lock of hair not always your own. The woman mutters as she grinds a combination of sage lavender and what looks suspiciously like dried moss. Next to her, a small linen pouch contains what the village whisperingly calls Toad's Blessing, a tiny dried frog wrapped in rose petals. It's been blessed by someone called Sister Elmira, who lives on the edge of the woods and hasn't paid taxes in 12 years. The goal here is clear: to convince a certain blacksmith, tall, silent, and allegedly cursed, to finally notice her before another harvest goes by, and she has to start talking to her geese again. Now here's your quirky detail. In some potion recipes, the dried frog wasn't ingested. It was sewn into the hem of a bride's dress. The logic: as the bride walked down the aisle, the spirit of the frog would leap her forward into a fruitful, faithful union. Bonus points if the frog had been caught on a Tuesday. Extra bonus if you hadn't named it. You peer into the pot as she stirs in a splash of honey and a single gooseberry. Then, for drama, she leans close and whispers the blacksmith's name 3 times. Once for the body, once for the heart, and once for luck. The mixture bubbles in approval or confusion. Hard to tell. And now she brings out the parchment. It's old, yellowed, possibly stolen from a monk who fell asleep during confession. On it is the original version of the Frog Bride recipe, written in rhyme, because nothing says love like poetry and poor life choices. The last line reads, "Boil the name, stir the flame, seal the kiss, leap past shame." You pretend not to notice her sneaking a glance at the window, hoping he'll pass by right this moment. He doesn't. Just a goat with a limp and very little emotional investment in local affairs. Let's drift into scholarly waters for a moment. Some historians believe these potions were more about confidence than chemistry. They gave women, especially those with little social power, something to do. A way to feel involved in their own destiny. Whether or not they worked was almost beside the point. The ritual itself became a form of quiet rebellion against a world that treated marriage as barter. You shift to the hearth, where another woman, probably her sister, is heating a small stone. This apparently is the activation stone meant to be dipped into the potion before it's stored. She rolls her eyes as she works, but still follows the directions. Even skeptics want results. And here's a fun side note. In one version of this tradition, from northern Italy, the potion had to be buried under the bed for 3 nights, then poured into a cup of wine and served without explanation. If he asked what was in it, it meant he wasn't the one. If he drank without question, marriage material. Or mildly reckless. Outside, the sun is dipping, and the room fills with the golden light of maybe it's working. The potion is poured into a small glass vial, tied with twine, and kissed for good measure. She places it on the windowsill to catch the moonlight, she says. Because even potions like compliments. The academic debate here. Some argue these recipes were less folk magic and more communal bonding, gathering herbs together, gossiping, passing knowledge through coded rituals. Others say no, it was very much magic. The frogs agree, but are unavailable for comment. You lean against the wall watching her light a candle. She looks tired, but hopeful. Not desperate, just determined. The kind of woman who's seen enough winters to know nothing blooms without some coaxing. Or a little amphibian intervention. And maybe, just maybe tomorrow, the blacksmith will look at her differently. Or maybe he'll keep hammering horseshoes while she secretly makes better ones out of copper and spite. Either way, the potion is ready. The leap of faith is bottled. The frog has done its part. 3 drowsy chuckles before you sleep. If he won't propose after you've boiled a frog for him, he's not worth the time. Love spells, because nothing says commitment like dried amphibians. Somewhere out there, a toad is wondering why it keeps waking up sewn into dresses. Toadstones for the taken. The market square is buzzing. Not the kind of buzzing that says we've had 3 plagues this season and everyone's nervous, but the kind that says someone just arrived with a bag of bones, a suspiciously glowing gem, and a pitch about true love insurance. Naturally, you're intrigued. You drift through the crowd, past the cheese merchant with the loud opinions and the quiet goat, until you find the source, a hunched man in a feathered cap, holding up what looks like a tiny milky gray pebble. He announces it with the confidence of someone who's never been fact-checked. Ladies and gentlemen, behold the Toadstone guardian of hearts, detector of poison and savior of marriages. Tonight's historical fact: in medieval Europe, toadstones, actually fossilized teeth of ancient fish, but believed to come from the heads of live toads, were prized as protective amulets. People thought they could ward off poison, detect lies, and in some cases protect against infidelity. Yes, if your spouse was unfaithful, the toadstone might allegedly heat up change color or leap out of its ring setting in dramatic protest. You move closer as the man pulls out a small ring. Set into it is a smooth, pale stone that doesn't look particularly magical. But in this town, neither does the mayor, and he once claimed to speak with bees. A noblewoman steps forward curious. She asks if it will keep her husband's eyes from wandering. The man responds without blinking. Only if he wears it, madam. If not, you might consider hiding one in his shoe. Here's tonight's quirky detail. Toadstones were sometimes sewn into clothing linings, worn as pendants, or even ground into powder, and slipped into drinks, especially in situations where trust was fragile and accusations were unwise. There's even a recipe from 1423 that suggests soaking the stone in vinegar and rubbing it on your spouse's wrist while they sleep. If they start talking in their dreams, that's your answer. If they start snoring louder, you just have a cleaner wrist. Let's pause for the scholarly angle. Naturalists like Albertus Magnus wrote about toadstones trying to explain their properties without fully debunking them. Because honestly, no one wanted to be the person who called a stone fake and then immediately got betrayed. Better safe than divorced. You follow the woman as she buys the stone, tucks it carefully into a silk pouch, and whispers something into it, possibly a prayer, possibly a complaint. The stone doesn't respond. It's dignified like that. Later that night, she places it under her husband's pillow. He grumbles in his sleep, mutters something about trout, and rolls over. No sign of betrayal. Yet. But she sleeps easier. Meanwhile, across town, a merchant sells toadstone rings to young lovers as engagement tokens, because nothing says forever like fossilized fish teeth with a reputation. You stroll past a row of stalls now closing down. The scent of roasted chestnuts lingers, along with the faint sound of a lute, playing the kind of melody that makes you want to sigh and buy unnecessary jewelry. One older couple sits by the well, their hands twined like vines, each wearing a toadstone ring. The woman nudges her husband and says, "Remember when yours flew off during that feast?" He laughs. "Yes, because I was lying about liking your aunt's stew." They kiss like it's still funny, which, to be fair, it is. Academic debate time. Were toadstones actually believed to detect cheating, or was that a later romanticized notion? Some argue the original use was strictly poison detection. Others claim the emotional warning aspect grew over time as more legends layered onto the idea of toads being magical liminal creatures. Either way, by the 16th century, toadstones appeared in everything from royal inventories to love poems. Queen Elizabeth vase reportedly had one set into a ring, probably more to avoid poison than heartbreak, but who's counting? You end your walk by the fountain watching reflections ripple across the surface. A child skips a stone, and for a second it shines like a toadstone might if it had just detected some minor emotional betrayal involving forgotten chores. You smile. It's not magic, maybe, but it's something. And in a world without texting therapy or prenups, a small rock that promised emotional truth was a comfort. Even if it didn't glow. Even if it just sat there quietly, like a pebble wearing a poker face. 3 sleepy chuckles before the next dream. Toadstones, because even your jewelry deserves an opinion on your relationship. Nothing says I trust you like hiding a fossil in someone's shoe. Remember, if your ring flies off mid-sentence, maybe it's not just bad luck. Croaking, under the moon. The night is thick and warm, the kind of evening that clings to your skin like a memory that overstayed its welcome. You're standing in a small village clearing somewhere between the fields and the forest where the air smells of firewood, ripening grain, and just a little mischief. Around you, women gather in a circle. Not witches, not officially. Just wives, widows, daughters, and someone named Aunt Lisa, who swears she can talk to crows. They all carry baskets filled with herbs, feather scraps of ribbon, and curiously small glass jars with holes punched in the lids. Inside each jar, one small frog. Tonight's historical fact in parts of medieval Europe, especially in rural and folk traditions, it was believed that frogs croaking at night, particularly under the full moon, could be used as a form of divination in love rituals. Depending on when the frogs croaked, how often and which direction they hopped afterward, women would interpret the signs to predict proposals, fidelity, or whether their crush would finally notice them after 5 months of bread baking and subtle glances. You're offered a seat on a soft patch of moss, still warm from the day. The woman next to you hands you a jar with a plump little frog inside and says matter-of-factly, If he croaks before the third verse of the chant, he says yes. If not, well, you can always marry a baker. Everyone chuckles, except for the frogs, who look mildly alarmed and deeply unimpressed. The leader of the group, an older woman with hair like storm clouds and a necklace made of lavender stems, begins the chant. It's low rhythmic, less a song than a coaxing hum, something between a lullaby and a dare. And then the frogs start. Not in harmony, of course. This isn't an opera. More like a chaotic amphibian jam session. Some croak, immediately loud and proud. Others just blink slowly, like they're waiting for a more emotionally resonant verse. One leaps right out of its jar and lands in the lap of a girl who gasps and declares breathlessly, "It's him. He's choosing me." Is it accurate? Who knows? But it's hopeful, and that counts for something. Now for tonight's quirky detail. In some versions of this ritual, participants would name their frogs after potential suitors. Whichever frog croaked first or hopped toward the fire was said to indicate the one most romantically aligned. Occasionally, a frog would be named after a husband, just to check if he was still in alignment. Of course, frogs are not subtle. Sometimes they croaked the loudest for the woman who hadn't even named them, causing weeks of awkward glances in church and at the well. But the frogs never apologized. They simply told the truth in whatever croaky, inconvenient way they pleased. Let's dip into academic waters for a moment. Scholars who study folk customs often note that these rituals served multiple purposes, not just divination, but communal bonding, emotional catharsis, and a sense of agency. In a time when most women had no say in who they married, a frog and a moonlit chant were as close to consent as the stars allowed. The chant continues. The frogs settle into their patterns. One woman cries softly when hers stays silent. Another lets out a joyful yelp when hers croaks 3 times, just as the moon peeks from behind a drifting cloud. You look up. The moon is full, round golden, mildly smug, and the sky is a dark velvet spattered with stars. Someone throws dried sage into the small bonfire, and the air briefly smells like spice and promise. Now, of course, not everyone approved. Church records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention such nocturnal gatherings as suspicious at best and heretical at worst. But unless someone was caught drawing circles in chalk or quoting the wrong book, most communities turned a blind eye, especially when it led to fewer tears and more weddings. You stay until the fire dies low and the women begin to drift home. Baskets, empty spirits, mixed. Some will dream well tonight, others not so much. But they'll all return next month, or the next, because in a world with little control, moonlight and frogs offer a kind of quiet magic no decree can outlaw. Before you sleep, 3 chuckles to stir your dreams. Frogs, the original relationship counselors paid in moonlight and bugs. If your frog croaks for someone else's chant, it's not betrayal. It's just complicated. No medieval man ever suspected his fate was being decided by a toad in a jar named Bertram. Monastic love and amphibians. The cloister is quiet stone archways, heavy with ivy, and the faint scent of beeswax and distant soup wafting through the cool air. You walk slowly along a corridor, footsteps soft against the worn slabs, passing stained glass windows that filter the morning light into sleepy blues and devout golds. This is a monastery, a place of prayer, silence, and frogs. Yes, frogs. Not hopping around the altar or leading hymns, although that image is delightful, but whispered about in corners, hidden in satchels, dreamed of behind shut eyes and shut doors. Tonight's historical fact: though monastic life in the Middle Ages emphasized celibacy and spiritual devotion, personal longing didn't vanish just because someone wore a robe and took a vow. In fact, certain monastic records and writings, especially from isolated abbeys, mention dreams, temptations, and yes, visions involving frogs. Some monks believed frogs appeared in dreams as symbols of affection or even as messengers of the Virgin Mary. Others, less mystically inclined, simply used frogs as coded symbols for desires they weren't supposed to express. You duck into a scriptorium where a young monk sits hunched over a page. His pen scratches delicately across the parchment. He writes poetry not for the church, but for someone unnamed. Someone whose smile he compares to the shimmer of frog-slick pond water. Romantic questionable, but deeply sincere. On his desk is a small covered jar. Inside it, a frog, of course. Not as a pet, not quite. More as a listener. A little green confessor who blinks croaks once every 20 minutes and has witnessed more secrets than most abbots. Here's your quirky detail. Some monks believed frogs because of their transformation from tadpole to adult symbolized internal spiritual growth, but others saw them as metaphors for suppressed affection, small, persistent, and always trying to escape. And now, the story of Brother Alric. Alric was a quiet monk, faithful, kind, terrible at cooking, but excellent at listening. Over time, his dreams began to fill with frogs, not just hopping through fields, but sitting beside him, speaking in riddles about love and longing. He told his confessor. The confessor nodded, then recommended colder baths. But the dreams didn't stop. One night, the frog in his vision sang, not croaked, sang. A lullaby in a voice that sounded suspiciously like the novice scribe from the next cell. Alric woke up sweating and deeply confused. Rather than interpret this as unholy temptation, he saw it as a call to deepen his compassion. He began composing psalms about transformation, renewal, devotion shaped like a green amphibian. Years later, his writings were found in a bundle tied with reeds alongside a tiny carved wooden frog. Some say it was a love letter never sent. Others call it the first recorded case of monastic frog-based theology. Either way, the poetry was quite good. Academics still argue about these frog mentions. Were they allegorical, suppressed expressions of loneliness, or genuine mystical encounters? After all, medieval monasteries were not immune to emotion. They were just very, very good at disguising it in metaphors and meticulous calligraphy. You sit quietly by a fountain in the monastery garden, now watching the water ripple. A frog lounges on the rim, half asleep, half judging. Maybe it knows something. Maybe it's just enjoying the sun. One monk strolls by, hands tucked into his sleeves. He pauses, smiles, and murmurs, "The frog is patient." The frog forgives and keeps walking. It's unclear whether that was wisdom or a very niche proverb, but you take it with you. Because in a world of vows and silence, the frog became a small rebellion, a symbol of emotion no less sacred, just because it wasn't written into the rule book. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's nice to think that somewhere tucked between illuminated letters and candlelight prayers, a frog quietly reminded a few lonely souls that love in all its forms still had a place within these walls. 3 monastic giggles before rest. Confessing to a frog is cheaper than therapy, and it never interrupts. If your dreams feature frogs in robes, maybe it's time to take a walk. Medieval monks couldn't flirt, so they wrote frog poems instead. honestly respect. Green eyes and green spells. You're standing at the edge of a marketplace that feels halfway between charming and cursed. The kind of place where someone's selling fresh pears next to someone else who claims their cat can see ghosts. A place where you can buy a sack of oats, a love charm, and mild regret all before lunch. The air smells like roasting onions, beeswax candles, and distant worry. And there, under a faded striped awning, sits a vendor whose entire stall is dedicated to frogs. Not frog legs, not frog soup. Frogs as magical consultants. She sits cross-legged on a cushion, surrounded by small cages, each containing a frog with different colored eyes. One golden, one gray, one so green it looks like it's been dipped in envy and moss. Hanging from the front of her stall is a painted sign that reads, "Eye color determines outcome. Choose wisely." Tonight's historical fact: in medieval folk magic, eye color, especially green, was often associated with emotional influence, enchantment, and even seduction. Combined with the frog's already transformation-heavy symbolism, people believed the color of a frog's eyes could affect the kind of spell it helped cast. A green-eyed frog, perfect for love charms and affection. A gray-eyed frog, better for breakups and protective wards. Red-eyed frogs were allegedly banned in 3 counties for being too dramatic. You lean closer as a nervous young man approaches the stall, cheeks flushed and hands stuffed awkwardly in his tunic. He doesn't speak right away, just points. The vendor nods and gestures to the green-eyed frog, small, smug, and perched on a cushion like royalty. This one for new love. Very fresh. Croaked 3 times at sunrise. Very lucky. She offers a small glass vial with a leaf floating inside, allegedly steeped in frog-blessed dew. The man pays with a silver coin and scurries off before anyone recognizes him. You stay, because this is fascinating. Here's tonight's peculiar side note in some love spell instructions from rural France and Bohemia. The spellcaster was told to look into the frog's eyes and say the name of the desired person aloud, believing that the frog's eye color would amplify the intention. A green-eyed frog, under the right moon phase, was said to store the name until the magic worked. You'd then release the frog near running water, preferably a romantic brook, or just a ditch that didn't smell terrible. You peek at the other frogs. The gray-eyed one refuses to move. The blue-eyed one stares directly at you, like it knows your middle school secrets. The vendor taps its cage and mutters, "That one's too honest." Makes people cry. Good for closure, bad for dates. Let's hop briefly into scholarly territory. Medieval grimoires, the less fiery cousins of spellbooks, sometimes listed animal companions to help focus energy. Frogs were useful not just for their symbolism, but for their availability. Easy to catch, easy to carry, and apparently emotionally intelligent enough to channel heartbreak. One monk wrote that the frog's gaze reflects the soul's desire. The same monk later renounced magic and became an expert in turnip farming, but still, it's in the records. The vendor now offers you a choice. Not to buy, just to observe. She opens the green-eyed frog's cage, places it gently on her palm, and lifts it to eye level. "Look," she says, not at the frog. At yourself through it. You do. And for a moment you feel it. Not a spell. Not a vision. But a tiny jolt of potential. The same feeling you get when someone holds your gaze a second too long, or when the air shifts before rain. The frog blinks. You blink. The world tilts a little, then rights itself. The frog hops back into its cage like nothing happened. The vendor shrugs. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it just stares at you until you question your life choices. She hands you a pressed leaf as a keepsake. No charge. You never know when you'll need a little green. You walk away as the sun dips low, and the frogs begin to sing croaks, rising in lazy, hopeful harmony. Somewhere, someone's falling in love. Somewhere else, someone's questioning it. And somewhere in between, a green-eyed frog is thinking about dinner. 3 enchanted chuckles to send you to sleep. Love potions come and go, but frogs with attitude are forever. If a frog stares too long, either it's magic or you've got food on your face. Medieval dating tip: choose the green-eyed frog, not the red-eyed one. Trust me. The Prince myth begins. You're kneeling by the edge of a quiet forest pond, the kind that reflects just enough moonlight to feel magical and just enough mosquito interest to feel realistic. The water is still, except for a single ripple near the middle. You think it might be a fish, but then it croaks. And so begins a myth that's hopped its way through centuries' bedtime stories and more questionable kissing decisions than we'll ever know the Frog Prince. Tonight's historical fact: while the most famous version of the Frog Prince comes from the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century, the idea that frogs could be enchanted humans, particularly princes, has roots that stretch back to medieval Europe. Long before it was a bedtime fairy tale, it was a whispered story shared between candlelight and giggles, often as a cautionary tale or a dare. You imagine a medieval girl, perhaps the daughter of a minor noble, stuck in a drafty tower, with nothing but embroidery and unrequited dreams. She hears a tale from a nursemaid about a frog who was once a prince cursed for his arrogance, his pride, or maybe for cheating at dice. Only a kiss could break the spell. She blinks, and then looks suspiciously at the frog outside her window. Here's your quirky detail tonight. In one early version of this tale from around the 13th century, the transformation didn't require a kiss at all. The girl simply had to throw the frog against the wall in frustration, and that broke the enchantment. Love apparently was more about exasperated consent than lip contact. Romantic. But as centuries passed and storytelling softened, the wall throwing gave way to kissing, and the tale grew warmer, more symbolic. The frog, once a figure of awkward otherness, became a stand-in for patience, persistence, and the idea that love may arrive in forms you don't expect, especially slimy ones. You shift on the bank, feeling the cool dampness of moss beneath your palms. A frog watches you from a lily pad, blinking like it's heard this story 1,000 times and is still waiting for someone to get it right. Let's take a quick academic detour. Scholars argue that the Frog Prince myth blends Christian allegory, pagan transformation motifs, and gendered ideas of virtue. In some versions, the princess's willingness to keep a promise even to a gross creature was seen as morally admirable. In others, it was about the redemptive power of love. And in a few delightful retellings, the frog was female, and it was the knight who had to prove himself by carrying her around for 3 days in his helmet. Yes, helmet love. It was a thing. Back to your pond. You see it clearly now. The myth didn't just come from nowhere. It came from moments like this. A still night. A curious girl. A world where frogs were already steeped in magic medicine and moony-eyed superstition. Add a sprinkle of boredom, a dash of symbolism, And voila, your romantic amphibian narrative writes itself. In fact, some medieval households kept pet frogs, believing they brought luck, fertility, and if you treated them kindly, good dreams. A frog hopping through your doorway was a sign someone new would enter your life. A frog croaking beneath your window, an admirer nearby, or just bad plumbing, but mostly romance. The frog in front of you croaks again, loud, slightly smug. You lean forward, and no, you don't kiss it. You're not that easily manipulated by folklore. But you do whisper, "I hope whoever you were, you're doing all right." It blinks. Maybe that's frog for you too. And now, before your eyes begin to flutter, closed, remember this: the Frog Prince story isn't about waiting for magic. It's about recognizing it even when it's damp, awkward, and sitting in mud. Love, like frogs, doesn't always look how you expect. But sometimes, if you're patient, it transforms into something remarkable. 3 tail-worthy chuckles before dream time. If a frog asks for a kiss check first, is it a prince or just very confident? Wall throwing used to break curses. Now, we just text and hope for closure. Medieval romance rule: always be nice to frogs. You never know who's cursed and rich. A brew for the betrothed. The morning begins with steam, soft, fragrant, and suspiciously green. You're standing in the corner of a modest medieval kitchen, the kind that seems held together by soot wooden beams and generational secrets. The fire crackles beneath a heavy iron pot, and inside it something stirs. Or, rather, bubbles. Tonight's historical fact: in certain medieval households, especially in the countryside, it was customary for newly engaged couples to drink a ceremonial brew made with symbolic ingredients to bless their union. Sometimes this meant wine, sometimes herbs, and in a surprising number of cases, a touch of frog-based extract. Yes, frogs. Again, the practice varied by region. In some places, it was just a single drop of water in which a frog had once been kept overnight, nothing too alarming. In others, the recipe called for powdered frog skin, often dried and steeped with rosemary, thyme, and clove. Why? Because transformation, obviously, and a little superstition never hurt anyone. Well, except maybe the frog. You glance at the woman tending the pot. She's a professional match brewer, known across 3 villages and 1 suspicious monastery for her engagement concoctions. Her hands move quickly, adding sprigs of dried lavender, crumbled bay leaf, and a single curl of orange peel. You'd think this was a soup. It's not. It's destiny in a cup. Next to her, wrapped in silk, in reverence, is a pouch containing the main ingredient, a tiny square of preserved frog skin pressed flat like a greenish herbarium page. She adds it to the brew, like one might add salt, calmly with a wink. Here's tonight's peculiar detail. In some traditions, the bride was supposed to stir the pot with her left hand while saying the name of her betrothed aloud exactly 7 times, pausing after each repetition to listen for a croak. If no frog croaked by the 7th name, it was considered a sign, a bad one. Of course, this is why many people hired someone else to do the stirring, just in case. You watch as the future bride, cheeks pink from either steam or nerves, lifts a ladle and pours the brew into 2 delicate clay cups. They're mismatched, one with a crack, one with a thumbprint, but that's love, isn't it? A bit lopsided often, overheated, but made to be shared. She hands 1 cup to her fiancé, who smells it, hesitates, and drinks. He doesn't die. Good start. She sips hers. Then both place their cups on the table and hold hands over a dried frog skull wrapped in ribbon. Not because it does anything, just because it's part of the tradition. And frogs deserve some closure too. Let's wander into academia for a moment. Historians suggest these kinds of brews were more about emotional ritual than chemical effect. The ingredients were chosen for their symbolic meanings: rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, frog essence for transformation. It wasn't about magic. It was about storytelling, drinking your intentions, and maybe proving to your in-laws that you were willing to sip something strange for love. Back in the kitchen, the match brewer smiles and hands them a small charm, a tiny metal frog with a heart carved into its back. They're to place it under their bed for the first 3 nights of marriage. Why? So your dreams leap in the right direction, she says with a practiced smirk. The couple leaves cups, rinse charm pocketed. The kitchen cools. The fire settles. The frog skin jar is resealed and returned to a high shelf labeled "Frog-related do not confuse with tea." Outside, the day is golden, the air filled with distant bells, and even more distant croaking. Somewhere, a toad hops into a puddle with the dignity of a guest who wasn't invited to the wedding, but came anyway. And you learned something. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is weirdly amphibious sometimes. 3 engaged giggles before bed. Nothing says forever like boiling herbs with reptile accessories. If he drinks the frog brew without flinching, he's a keeper or has no sense of smell. Love may be blind, but it's apparently got a great palate for pond-based potions. The court toad. The palace smells faintly of cinnamon-polished brass and political tension. You've wandered into the outer chambers of a minor noble's estate, lavish, but lived in like a crown that's been borrowed one too many times. And in the corner, beneath a gilded window and beside an ornately carved stand that once held something religious, but now holds something squishy, sits the court toad. Yes, a toad. Fat, regal, unblinking, and technically on payroll. Tonight's historical fact: in several medieval courts, especially in Central Europe and parts of France, noble families kept toads or frogs as symbolic creatures thought to absorb bad luck, ward off envy, or even serve as companions for noble children. In rare cases, they were named clothed and granted nicknames like Fortune's Buffer or the Damp Chancellor. One particularly extravagant noble allegedly claimed his toad could predict betrayal based entirely on how loudly it belched during dinner. You approach the pedestal. The toad blinks at you with the confidence of someone who's witnessed 4 family scandals and outlived 3 household cats. It's wearing a small chain collar, not tight, just decorative, with a tiny bell shaped like a fly. A servant approaches with a tray. On it, a silver dish of damp bread, soaked in rose water, and 2 pieces of roasted beetle. This is not for you. This is the toad's lunch. Here's your delightful detail tonight. In some aristocratic circles, it became fashionable to gift amphibians to newly formed alliances. A well-fed toad, particularly one raised by hand, was seen as a charm of constancy. Keeping it near the marital bed or court chamber supposedly helped maintain emotional stability. Whether that meant warding off adultery nightmares or bad poetry depends on the region. This particular toad, named Sir Burble, according to a small plaque, is a gift from a cousin king across the mountains. He was introduced at a banquet carried on a crimson velvet cushion by a man who refused to blink. No one has dared ignore him since. Let's enter the scholarly corridors for a moment. Some historians view the court toad trend as a convergence of herbalist beliefs, symbolic animal lore, and upper-class eccentricity. In texts like The Mirror of Beasts, circa 1290, toads were described as earthbound spirits of perception, able to feel the unspoken in men's hearts. Others simply considered them a noble's version of a conversation piece with legs. You watch now as a visiting noblewoman enters. She curtsies, not to the host, but to the toad. The room follows her lead. It's unclear whether they're joking or just hedging their bets. Because in a world where fortunes turn faster than a spitted boar and alliances rest on how one greets someone else's pet, maybe giving respect to a frog isn't the weirdest strategy. Sir Burble makes a small noise. The steward notes it in a book. Later, you overhear a conversation between two courtiers debating whether that sound indicated approval of the Duke's latest proposal or indigestion from last night's cricket custard. Either way, adjustments will be made, just in case. Now, for a peculiar footnote, some nobles claimed their court toads had dreams, yes, dreams that could be interpreted like omens. One toad reportedly began twitching violently the night before a marriage alliance collapsed. Another was said to have leapt into a goblet of wine the night a rival was poisoned. Coincidence, of course. Probably. Maybe. You take one last look at Sir Burble. He blinks again, then very slowly licks his eye. Regal. Outside, the banners flap in the wind, and a herald practices the correct way to introduce Her Highness Keeper of the Toad. No one laughs. Titles are serious business. You smile as you leave the chamber. Because honestly, in a castle full of schemes, the quietest creature may be the wisest, and the slipperiest ally might just be the one that fits in your palm. 3 noble chuckles before dreams. If your toad wears jewelry, you might be nobility or deeply committed to the bit. Nothing says court intrigue like a belching amphibian with a nameplate. Always bow to the toad. Worst case, you look eccentric. Best case, you survive the week. Singing frogs, silent vows. The chapel is small old and smells like candle wax, wilted lavender, and damp stone that's forgotten the sun. You're sitting in the last pew, more like a bench with ambition, while a wedding unfolds just a few feet ahead. It's quiet, reverent. The bride's veil trembles slightly, possibly from nerves, possibly from the breeze sneaking in through a cracked stained glass window, depicting St. Gilda and what appears to be a hedgehog. Outside, however, it's anything but quiet, because down by the pond, just behind the chapel, the frogs are singing. And the priest is not pleased. Tonight's historical fact: in some rural parts of medieval Europe, particularly in the British Isles and central France, it was believed that frogs croaking during a wedding ceremony was a sign of approval from nature, or sometimes the spirits of fertility and love. In these communities, the silence of frogs was more alarming than their song. If the frogs stopped croaking altogether, bad omen. Someone was either lying cursed or had forgotten to properly bathe. The priest clears his throat. He continues the vows. The groom stammers. The frogs crescendo. From your seat, you can see the chapel doors are cracked open, letting in light and sound. The frog's song rises and falls like a choir that never learned Latin but knows the rhythm of hearts anyway. And here's your quirky detail tonight. Some families would intentionally schedule weddings during frog-rich months, late spring, early summer, specifically to encourage the chorus. In a few traditions, people even brought frogs in small woven baskets to release near the altar post-ceremony, like a medieval version of confetti with legs. You glance at an old woman near the front, who keeps glancing over her shoulder at the noise. She nods once, then leans to whisper to the person beside her. They're singing now. That means the first child will come quick. No one questions this. Let's tiptoe into the archives. Medieval marriage rites were steeped in layers of ritual, both official and folk-based. While the church provided the formal structure, villagers often added their own layers, blending older pagan traditions into the ceremony. Frogs, seen as creatures of change, moisture, and abundance, naturally hopped into these customs. Some texts even reference frog blessings, superstitious or not. People believed the little green creatures were attuned to emotional weather. The priest tries to carry on. Do you take raibitet? The entire front row stifles giggles. The bride, to her credit, does not laugh, but she does smile, just slightly, which according to local lore means the marriage will be long and blessed, unless she trips on her hem before the first dance. After the ceremony, the guests step outside into warm air that smells of wildflowers and fresh bread. The frogs continue their performance tucked along the edge of the pond like slimy little violinists. Someone tosses flower petals. Someone else accidentally tosses a handkerchief into the water, and a particularly bold toad claims it as a throne. You notice a small sign near the chapel's gate, Frog Song Welcome. Please do not shush. Turns out the village takes its omens seriously. One young couple, not yet wed, stands near the water holding hands. When a frog croaks directly in front of them, they gasp. A witness. An endorsement. A green goopy matchmaker with timing. Now let's stir in a dash of skepticism. Some clerics in the 14th century argued against this frog fascination, claiming it bordered on idolatry. One bishop in 1347 declared that no beast of pond or fen shall sanctify the holy union. His edict was ignored, and the frogs croaked louder that week than ever before. You sit now by the pond, watching the lily pads bob. The bride has taken off her shoes and dipped her toes in the water. Her groom stands nearby, one arm around her waist, the other holding a pastry he's not supposed to eat yet. They look happy. A frog leaps between them. No one screams. They just laugh and let it pass. And in this moment, it's easy to believe that maybe frogs do know something we don't. Maybe their music has always meant something more. 3 soft croaks of humor before you doze. If your wedding band isn't blessed by frogs, is it really official? The best wedding singers are small green and only require swamp access. When love is real, even the frogs RSVP. Amphibian Astrology. You're lying on a soft patch of hillside cloak beneath you, wildflowers tickling your elbows, and the night sky wide open above like someone just pulled back the velvet curtain of the universe. Stars blink overhead, ancient, aloof, and utterly uninterested in your crush on the village baker. But not everyone leaves their romantic fate to the stars. Tonight's historical fact: in some pockets of late medieval Europe, particularly among rural folk practitioners and fringe astrologers, there existed a curious fusion of astrology and amphibian behavior, a practice where frogs were used as living star charts. Yes, you heard that correctly. Frogs. Jumping horoscopes with opinions. You shift slightly and peer downhill, where an astrologer sits cross-legged in the grass, surrounded by a ring of stones. Inside the ring 7 frogs, each one labeled with a small ribbon corresponding to a celestial body. Venus, Mars, Saturn, the works. The frogs are not aware of their responsibilities. but they croak on cue. The astrologer consults a chart, murmurs something about Venus being in the 7th house, and drops a single drop of lavender oil onto the ground. The frogs shift. One hops toward the east. Another licks its own foot. The crowd leans in. A girl beside you whispers, "If the frog named Mars jumps first, it means her new beau is full of passion, but prone to dramatic exits." You don't ask how frogs became messengers of cosmic truth. You just nod. It's safer that way. Here's tonight's peculiar detail. Practitioners of this folk science believe that frogs, being creatures of earth and water, were particularly sensitive to lunar tides, planetary pull, and emotional disturbances. Some claimed frogs croaked more under certain signs. Others swore their jump patterns could predict everything, from fertility windows to affair alerts. Think of it as Mercury retrograde, but with legs. You sit up a bit and watch as the astrologer waves a wand, not magical, just very enthusiastic, and records each frog's movements in a book titled Leaping Stars, a study of amphibian influence in human romance. You suspect it's self-published. Let's drift into academic debate. Some scholars chalk this practice up to pattern-seeking behavior, the same instinct that finds faces in toast or fate in tea leaves. Others suggest that in the absence of formal astrology, education, rural people created their own cosmic systems using what was available: frogs, ditches, moonlight, and an endless appetite for signs. And truthfully, who can blame them if a frog jumping east gave someone the confidence to flirt with the stable boy or finally propose to the miller's daughter? Then the method worked, didn't it? You wander down to the circle. The astrologer squints at you, then gestures to the frog labeled Venus. Ask it a question of the heart, she says. You kneel. The frog blinks. You whisper, "Is this thing with the innkeeper's niece going anywhere?" The frog croaks, once hops in a small circle, and then sits absolutely still. The astrologer beams. A strong yes, and possibly soup. She's a good cook. Later, as the frogs are gently returned to their traveling basket, lined with damp moss and fresh mint for ambiance, you find yourself smiling. Not because the stars were clearer tonight, but because sometimes belief lives in the small, strange rituals, the ones with webbed feet and zero comprehension of your feelings. A note from the record's one 15th century manuscript called Of Creatures and Constellations suggests a full moon jump from a frog marked Jupiter was an excellent omen for long-term partnership, unless it jumped twice. Then it meant too much family involvement. You lie back again, letting the sky return to its quiet, expansive indifference. The astrologer hums a tune. The frogs settle in their box. Somewhere in the distance, an owl questions everything. And you feel oddly seen. 3 ribbit-inspired giggles before dreams. If Mercury in retrograde causes drama, imagine 6 frogs in a basket. Forget horoscopes. Give me a frog scope with fewer metaphors and more movement. Frogs may not know your birth chart, but they'll hop like it matters. The toad and the trial. The courthouse is damp. Not because of rain, though it did rain loudly earlier, but because someone insisted on holding the trial next to the well, which leaks groans, and has recently become the home of an unusually loud toad. You're seated near the back, sandwiched between a man who smells like pickled onions and a woman knitting what looks suspiciously like a noose for a duck. Everyone here is buzzing, not about the defendant, who may or may not be present, but about the toad. Tonight's historical fact, in several recorded medieval witch trials, especially those in England and northern France. Toads were presented as evidence of witchcraft, either as familiar spell ingredients or accomplices. Yes, accomplices. People believed toads could speak spy curse, or in one highly suspicious case, steal eggs from a locked chest and deliver them to a rival midwife. You lean forward as the bailiff very solemnly unrolls a piece of parchment and reads the charges. Marjorie Knot Spinner, of Wool Keeper, of Hens Harborer, of Suspicious Amphibians. There's a gasp. Marjorie, a woman with shoulders like broom handles and a face permanently unimpressed, stands beside her bench, arms crossed. She does not deny owning a toad. In fact, she volunteers its name Balthazar. He lives in my bread bin, she says deadpan. He only comes out when someone gossips. This does not help her case. Here's tonight's peculiar detail. Some trial records include accounts of accused witches being found with toads who wore tiny clothes or had human-sounding names. Balthazar, Crispin, Gertrude. These were considered signs of a creature sent by the devil to aid in casting spells or tempting bakers into burning pies. Toads were seen as ideal familiars, quiet, sneaky, and always conveniently moist. The judge, a man who has clearly never smiled in his life and believes frogs belong only in stew, clears his throat. And what say you to the charge that your toad predicted the plague by croaking 3 nights in a row? Marjorie shrugs. Maybe he's just intuitive. A ripple of laughter passes through the courtroom, quickly silenced by a stern glance. The toad, perched in a small cage near the witness stand, blinks. Slowly, with the gaze of someone who knows exactly how many of these people have secrets buried in their cabbage patches. Let's slip into academic robes for a moment. Witch trials in medieval Europe were chaotic mixtures of folklore, misogyny, and misunderstood biology. Animals that were once seen as magical helpers, like frogs, cats, or birds, suddenly became incriminating. If a toad followed you home, omen. If it croaked during someone's toothache, curse. If it sat silently in your lap while you gossiped, devil's assistant. And yet, despite the absurdity, people believed. Fear gave shape to the formless, and toads, unbothered by politics or courtroom etiquette, became scapegoats with strong thighs. Back at the trial, a neighbor testifies that Balthazar once glared at her so intensely that her soup spoiled. Another claims he blinked twice and her husband tripped in the fields the next morning. It's a compelling case, mostly because people are scared and Balthazar keeps blinking in all the wrong moments. Marjorie is eventually fined for failure to maintain respectable toad boundaries and told to keep him out of communal spaces. She nods, takes Balthazar's cage, and leaves with her head high. You follow her out of the courthouse. She sets the cage down, opens the door, and watches as Balthazar hops out, lands in a puddle, and lets out a croak so perfectly timed it feels like a mic drop. She grins. I told them he only speaks when it matters. She picks him up, gently tucks him under her shawl, and walks home like nothing happened. And in that moment, you realize something in a world that feared the unusual. The quiet strength of a woman and her toad was revolutionary. 3 rebellious giggles before bed. If your toad gets summoned to court, consider hiring a better lawyer. Nothing ruins a witch trial like a familiar with stage presence. Medieval lesson: never underestimate a toad named Balthazar. Frogs in the chapel. It's Sunday. The bells toll with that particular urgency they reserve for holy days and tax collection, and you find yourself shuffling into a village chapel tucked between two lopsided apple trees, and one persistent rumor about a haunted loaf of bread. The chapel itself is simple wooden beams, uneven stone floor, an air that smells like old prayers and damp wool. But today, it smells like something else, like pond. And that's because there are frogs in the chapel. Not in a cute, accidental, oops, it rained and they hopped in way. No. These frogs are meant to be here. Tonight's historical fact: in certain medieval regions, especially in parts of Eastern Europe and isolated monastic communities, frogs were considered symbolic creatures of humility, rebirth, and unvoiced intercession. And during special services, like marriages, rain blessings, or cleansing rites, it wasn't unheard of for frogs to be present in the chapel, sometimes even placed in decorative bowls or allowed to roam near the altar. You take a seat near the back. A small frog stares at you from under the pew, as if to ask whether your soul is ready for whatever's about to happen. The priest clears his throat. Let us be still. The frogs are not still. They begin croaking soft at first, then, with the layered rhythm of a dozen tiny throats tuning their instruments. It's oddly musical. The choir boy next to you flinches. The organist pretends nothing's happening. One particularly bold frog hops down the aisle as if auditioning for sainthood. Here's tonight's curious detail in some spiritual interpretations of the time frogs were thought to utter prayers on behalf of those who could not speak, the sick, the outcast, the poor. Their croaking, especially during services, was believed by some to be a natural chorus of intercession offered freely and without vanity. As one 14th century monk wrote, "They do not lie, they do not flatter. Their song is their honesty." Of course, not everyone agreed. A bishop once banned frogs from a cathedral after one reportedly leapt into a baptismal font mid-ceremony and was later found napping in the wine chalice. Still, local villagers smuggled frogs back in during evening services, tucking them in pockets, baskets, or under long sleeves. You glance at the woman beside you. Her shawl shifts ever so slightly. A faint ribbit follows. You pretend not to notice. Now let's step into the archives. Religious iconography occasionally features frogs, not as demons as later Renaissance thinkers painted them, but as earthy symbols of grounded faith. They dwell in mud, but rise through song. They live low, yet call high. A few theologians even argued that frogs embodied the monastic ideal, silent by day vocal, in darkness, constant in their rhythm. Back in the chapel, the priest carries on. His voice rises above the croaking, not to compete, but to accompany. It's as if the frogs are part of the liturgy now. The congregation doesn't flinch. A child giggles once, but is hushed by a parent who secretly smiles. And then comes the part of the ceremony where everyone is invited to offer silent prayers. But it isn't silent, because as the people close their eyes, the frogs begin a slow, harmonious call. Not loud, not frantic, just present, persistent, like water dripping through stone, like the earth whispering on your behalf. The priest opens his arms. Let even the smallest voices rise. And for once, everyone agrees. As the service ends, the frogs are gently herded back toward the chapel door by a young girl holding a staff wrapped in lily leaves. Some hop, some pause dramatically. One simply sits and refuses to leave. That one gets a gentle pat and a bit of apple peel as a bribe. You walk out into the sun air, sweet with grass and wet stone, and behind you the croaking continues, just faintly from the windows. Because faith, like frogs, is sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but always nearby, if you stop long enough to listen. 3 riveting chuckles before rest. If your chapel doesn't offer frog accompaniment, is it really medieval? Choir boys sing in Latin. Frogs sing in blorp. Both reach heaven. When in doubt, bring a toad to church. Just maybe not the wine cup. Love charms and pond slime. You're elbow deep in pond muck. Don't worry, it's the romantic kind. At least that's what the local hedge witch promised when she sent you to collect a very specific handful of slime from a very specific pool at a very specific hour under a very specific moon. The instructions were clear. Not the murky pond by the mill that one makes people smell like regret. Go to the one behind the orchard where frogs sing in C minor. You didn't know frogs had a preferred key, but here you are. The slime is surprisingly silky, clings to your fingers like a clingy X, and glows faintly under the moonlight, like it knows it's about to be part of something powerfully questionable. Tonight's historical fact: in parts of medieval Europe, especially the Low Countries and northern Italy, pond slime was considered a potent magical ingredient in folk love charms. Mixed with herbs, ash, or bits of bone, it was believed to contain essence of transformation. After all, frogs came from that slime. And frogs could turn hearts summon dreams, and according to one particularly ambitious potion recipe, make the unloved noticed. You trudge back toward the cottage with your jar of goo, and just enough dignity left to knock twice before entering. The hedge witch, who goes by Mistress Fen, smells like thyme and has one eye that seems to judge you faster than the other, takes the jar and sniffs it. Citrusy. You did well. She places it next to a bowl containing dried rose petals, bee wing powder, and what looks suspiciously like a molar. You don't ask. Romance, as they say, is not for the faint of heart or stomach. Here's tonight's peculiar detail: one preserved love charm from a 15th century apothecaries book describes a process where pond slime was rubbed on door handles, bedposts, or shoes belonging to a desired lover. Supposedly, this would soften their gaze and open their heart. If that didn't work, a second application involved whispering their name into a frog's mouth and releasing it toward the sunrise. Subtle. You watch now as Mistress Fen begins the mixing. The slime goes in last. It swirls, glistens, and immediately tries to escape the bowl. She pushes it back down with a twig. It's feisty, she notes. That's good. She pours the final mixture into a tiny bottle, corks it with wax, and wraps it in blue cloth. Here, she says, handing it over, like it's a family heirloom with commitment issues, a charm for the lovelorn. Place a drop on the threshold of your interest's home, or failing that, on their favorite spoon. You nod slowly, and if they notice, she shrugs. Then you explain you were blessing their flatware. Most people are flattered. Let's pause here for an academic wink. Scholars have found dozens of such recipes across medieval Europe. Most were local and highly personalized, often passed down orally and tweaked depending on region. The common thread: they usually relied on natural substances associated with change mystery and things that made people go, you. Hence, frog slime. It was the glitter of medieval enchantment, sticky, misunderstood, and everywhere. You take your charm and wander into the village square. Night has settled, and windows glow like soft lanterns. Somewhere, someone is laughing over bread. Somewhere else, someone is crying into soup. And across the street, the one you've been quietly noticing is still awake, humming a song you don't quite recognize. You hesitate, and then you reach into your pocket, pull out the bottle, and dab one tiny drop on the windowsill, just in case. A frog croaks nearby. Coincidence, who's to say? Because whether magic is real or just the courage we pretend into existence, there's something undeniably bold about believing that pond muck might hold affection in its murky little molecules. You walk away, smiling, half hopeful, half horrified, entirely medieval. 3 slimy little laughs before dreams. If someone slime bombs your doorstep check for witchy intentions before mopping. Nothing says, "I like you" like enchanted algae. Love is blind, but pond slime, that stuff sees everything. The boil and the blush. You're standing in front of a mirror that isn't a mirror at all, just a particularly shiny piece of hammered tin, nailed to a wall, and polished with someone's sleeve grease and misplaced ambition. It reflects your face in vague, haunted outlines. And there it is, a boil, dead center, glowing like it has a social life. Now, in most centuries, this would be cause for embarrassment. But in medieval Europe, at least in this particular village, the sight of a boil, especially one that appeared after a brush with pond water, was not entirely a curse. Sometimes it was considered a sign of love. Tonight's historical fact: among certain folk traditions in medieval Central Europe, it was believed that a boil blemish or unexpected blush caused by contact with frogs or frog water could be interpreted as a physical reaction to romantic influence, or even as a mystical link between two souls. The body's way of saying, "Hey, someone likes you," and also, maybe don't touch that frog again. You're not convinced. The tin doesn't lie, but it does smudge generously. You recall the day before down by the brook, when you tried to rescue a particularly bloated frog from a tangle of reeds. It stared at you, judgmental, possibly sarcastic, and then, as you lifted it gently, it let out a noise so alarming it vibrated your wrist. You swore you felt something, tingles, or spores, and now boil. Here's tonight's bizarre but documented detail. A few old remedies for love boils involved rubbing the blemish with the leaf of a stinging nettle, then whispering the name of the suspected admirer into a toadstool. Not a person, not a letter, a toadstool. Nature apparently had a whole gossip network we'll never understand. You wander through the village with your hood low. But of course, there's no hiding anything in a medieval town where privacy is a myth, and everyone knows which cheese you bought last week. An old woman spots you. "Haha, frog kiss," she says knowingly. You blink. She continues. "They always leave a mark. It's good luck. Means you're being noticed." And then she hands you a piece of salted turnip and walks away. Like that explained everything. Let's hop into the academic well for a second. Medical texts of the time often tried to explain skin eruptions with imbalanced humors, blood bile phlegm, and frog juice unofficial. But in the less clinical, more imaginative parts of Europe, these blemishes were read like omens. A boil near the lips, someone desires a kiss. On the cheek, longing from afar. On the hand, you've touched someone whose heart wants yours, or who just didn't wash. Back at the healer's hut, you submit yourself for inspection. She peers at your boil, squints, then dabs something that smells like basil and desperation onto it. "Don't pop it," she warns. "You'll ruin the connection." Connection. She leans in, whispering like the boil itself might eavesdrop. Sometimes frogs carry messages. Emotion seeps into their skin. You touch one during a moon phase like this. Of course it leaves a mark. You ask the obvious. "So, someone likes me?" She shrugs, or hates you with romantic intensity. Hard to say. Still, she hands you a charm, a tiny scrap of cloth, soaked in river water, and tied with a frog's eyelash. You don't ask how she acquired that. You're told to sleep with it under your pillow and pay attention to who appears in your dreams. That night you dream of bread, then of frogs, then of someone standing beside a stream holding a flower blinking slowly. When you wake, the boil is smaller. Coincidence healing, or a love story unfolding in pus and poetry. You're not sure. But you walk to the stream again the next day, just in case the frog's still there. Spoiler it is, and it blinks, like it remembers everything. 3 blush-worthy chuckles before you drift off. If your acne speaks of affection, consider it medieval flirting. Boils the skin's way of saying someone maybe kinda likes you-ish. If a frog gives you feelings and inflammation, it's probably fate. Alchemy of Affection. The alchemist's tower leans slightly to the left. Not dangerously, but enough to suggest that architectural planning bowed to enthusiasm at some point in its creation. You're standing in a round room that smells like burnt thyme beeswax and the unmistakable tang of romantic failure. Shelves line the walls cluttered with jars, labeled things like essence of longing, extract of sigh, and rather alarmingly, congealed hope. But the most prominent container sits under a glass dome at the center of the room, resting on velvet, guarded by a circle of dried frog toes, arranged like compass points. It's labeled frog hearts, stabilized. Tonight's historical fact: some medieval alchemists believed that frogs possessed a natural emotional frequency, making them suitable for love-related elixirs. Their beating hearts were said to be attuned to the energies of desire and transformation, perfect for concoctions designed to inspire affection, restore warmth between distant spouses, or clarify matters of the heart. All incredibly vague, all deeply sought after. The alchemist before you, Master Jorund, a man with wild eyebrows and a voice like damp vellum, leans over a cauldron that simmers with pink vapor. He sprinkles in something from a silver spoon. A hiss follows. The air now smells like cinnamon and regret. A touch more affection, he mutters. He opens the jar. Inside, dried frog hearts, delicately preserved small as thimbles, each one tucked in a bed of rose petals. He adds one to the brew. This is the tricky part, he says. If it steeps too long, you get obsession. Too short, and it's just mild politeness. Here's tonight's peculiar side note: frog hearts weren't always literal. In some texts, frog heart referred to a metaphorical component, a blend of herbs or minerals, mimicking the amphibians' emotional volatility. The phrase became shorthand for a particular class of potions, messy, unpredictable, and always tied to love. You peer into the cauldron. The liquid churns, changes color, and for one brief moment, shimmers with the image of someone's face. You don't recognize them, yet. Let's enter the scholarly chambers. Alchemy was rarely just about turning lead into gold. It was philosophical chemistry, deeply tied to spiritual transformation. The idea of distilling emotion into a bottle, especially affection, was less about science and more about symbolism. The frog, with its ability to evolve to thrive in water and land, became a symbol of emotional complexity. And nothing says alchemy like attempting to bottle the messiest human feeling using amphibians. Master Jorund continues his lecture. The frog connects the elements: water, for feeling earth, for grounding air, for desire and fire. Well, fire happens when things go wrong. He points to a shelf labeled Former Experiments. Most of the bottles are empty. One is scorched. He decants a drop of the finished elixir into a glass vial. The liquid inside swirls with an opalescent glow. He hands it to you. Use sparingly, he says, and only on someone who's already thinking about you. Otherwise, it just smells nice and makes frogs in the area unusually clingy. You don't ask how he tested that. Outside, the evening is cool. You walk along the cobblestones, the vial heavy in your pocket, warm as if it knows it's holding something complicated. You pass a familiar window, someone you've been admiring from a polite medieval distance. They're there laughing over a cup, unaware of the philosophical chemistry stirring just 10 feet away. You hesitate, and then quietly, you pull the vial and uncork it. A wisp of fragrance escapes. Not perfumed, not sweet. Just possible. The wind carries it toward the window. Inside, the person pauses, looks up, sniffs the air, smiles. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's frog heart vapor. You recork the vial. Just one drop. That's enough. Alchemy is about balance after all. 3 potion-worthy chuckles before bedtime. Love potions because dating apps didn't exist, but frogs definitely did. If your crush likes you after smelling boiled frog hearts, it's probably destiny. Alchemy tip: always label your jars. Affection and mild paralysis look very similar. Croak and commitment. The pond is unusually quiet tonight. Not silent. There's always something squishing, chirping, or rustling, but the usual chorus of croaking has dipped into a soft, thoughtful murmur. Like even the frogs know this is a big moment. You're standing near the water's edge lantern and hand-facing someone who just asked you a question. A big question. And now, apparently you're both waiting for a frog to respond. Tonight's historical fact in some medieval communities, particularly in parts of Brittany, Bavaria, and the Scottish lowlands. It was customary during courtship or engagement ceremonies to include a frog as a natural witness to the pledge. Why? Because frogs were believed to be loyal listeners, symbolizing consistency, natural rhythms, and long-term transformation, all essential ingredients for a successful union. Some couples made their commitment beside a frog-filled stream or pond, believing the frog's croaks sealed the bond. If a frog croaked at the right moment, it was a sign of blessing. If the frogs went silent, some took it as a cue to reconsider. No pressure, of course. You and your almost betrothed stand shoulder to shoulder. Between you, a small stone slab serves as a makeshift altar. Upon it sits a candle, a ribbon, and of course a frog. Specifically, a plump green one with the suspiciously wise name of Edgar. Here's tonight's quirky detail. Certain traditions included naming the frog after a respected elder or a long-married relative in hopes that the frog would carry the essence of their endurance. Edgar, in this case, is named after a grandfather who survived 2 famines, 5 winters, and 1 particularly confusing dinner with royalty. Edgar croaks. Once, loud, then falls silent. The 2 of you glance at each other. The timing was suspiciously perfect. The elder officiant nods approvingly. The frog has spoken. Let's take a scholarly sip. Historians note that rituals involving animals, especially amphibians, weren't just quirky. They reflected the medieval worldview where nature participated in human affairs. Frogs, associated with water symbol of life and continuity, became natural metaphors for enduring emotion. When 2 people stood before water, declaring affection, and the frogs croaked in rhythm, that was the universe nodding in agreement, slimy and enthusiastic. Back at the pond, you and your partner exchange simple tokens, woven grass rings, tiny charms shaped like lily pads. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet understanding. The officiant concludes the rite by gently tipping Edgar off the stone. He lands with a wet plop hops once and disappears into the reeds. The symbolism. The bond has been accepted and returned to nature's keeping. Later, you sit near the water on a wool blanket, sipping something warm and mildly spiced. The stars blink above you, coy and cozy. Your partner leans their head against your shoulder. You both listen to the frogs start up again, louder now, more joyful. A chorus of croaks like a wedding band that only plays in ribbits. A few couples in the village still do it this way. No priests, no pomp. Just a frog, a flame, and a feeling. And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes commitment doesn't need trumpets or declarations carved in stone. Sometimes it's just a shared look, a hopeful croak, and the quiet understanding that neither of you are running away. Well, unless the frog does. But that's Edgar. He has things to do. 3 riveting chuckles before dreamland. If your engagement needs a witness, frogs work cheaper than lawyers. Commitment level 1, croak from Edgar, and you're basically married. Forget diamonds. Show me a relationship sealed with amphibian approval. Frog skin and faithfulness. It's late. The kind of late where the stars look sharper than usual, and the wind whispers just enough to make your cloak flap dramatically even when you're standing still. You're in a candlelit chamber, modest, warm, and filled with the soft rustling of cloth being folded, vows being whispered, and a frog skin glove being pulled out of a drawer with surprising reverence. Yes, a glove made from frog skin, lined with linen, and stitched with thread dyed from crushed nettles and allegedly marital hope. Tonight's historical fact: in some regions during the late Middle Ages, particularly among certain noble and merchant classes, it was believed that clothing made with frog skin, especially gloves, symbolized fidelity. When given as a gift between spouses or betrothed partners, a frog skin glove was thought to preserve loyalty, ward off temptation, and even alert the wearer to betrayal, often by stiffening or changing color when handled by someone with dishonest intentions. You're watching now as a young woman smooths the gloves out on her lap. One is hers. The other, slightly larger, marked with a stitched initial, is for her husband, who's been away on business, or crusade, or possibly just avoiding his mother-in-law. It's hard to say. She presses the gloves to her heart before tucking them into a satchel ready for delivery. Here's tonight's peculiar detail. In some romantic folk traditions, a frog skin glove was buried under the marriage bed or sewn discreetly into the headboard. It was believed that if one partner strayed, the frog skin would either dry out, crack loudly, or begin emitting a strange scent that only the wronged heart could smell. Unscientific, deeply. Effective at preventing guilt-fueled insomnia. Surprisingly so. Let's dip into academic waters. The use of animal skin in medieval fashion was common, but frog skin was rare. Thin, tricky to prepare, and difficult to preserve without the right mix of herbs and careful tanning. That made it valuable, symbolic, and largely ceremonial. While no confirmed fidelity gloves survive today, likely due to rot rats and history's general disinterest in frog couture, several merchant inventories from the 14th and 15th centuries list items like green glove for loyalty and toad lining for quiet devotion. Back in the chamber, the woman lights a small candle in a niche above her bed and places a carved wooden frog beside it. The frog's mouth is slightly open, as if it's just about to say, "He'd better not be flirting with that tavern girl in Antwerp." You hear the wind shift. She smiles faintly, like she's won a game no one else knew was being played. Outside, in another part of town, her husband returns. tired, dusty, very aware he forgot their anniversary 2 months ago. He reaches into his travel pack and pulls out a frogskin belt pouch. The stitching is clumsy, the shape is off, but it's real, and it's his apology, because even a man who can't remember feast days knows that frogs mean something. Something sticky, something loyal, something real. He lays it on the table. The frog skin glints faintly in the firelight, catching the same stars she just wished on. They'll be fine. 3 faith-filled croaks before dream time. If your love language is amphibian leather, you may be medieval. Frogskin gloves, because sometimes fidelity needs a fashionable threat. Nothing says I'm committed like wearing your heart and a toad on your sleeve. The last leap of love. The pond is still tonight. Still in that heavy, breath-holding way that comes right before something changes. You're sitting on a smooth rock warmed faintly by the day's fading sun, listening to the frogs hum like the earth itself is sighing in a rhythm too old for clocks. Across the water, 2 frogs sit side by side. Not hopping, not croaking, just sitting, together. And in this village, that means something. Tonight's historical fact in some medieval folk tales, particularly those preserved in oral traditions of the Alpine regions, there exists a recurring motif of lovers turned into frogs, either by curse, divine punishment, or occasionally their own choosing. But unlike other animal transformation tales, these frog lovers didn't always want to be changed back. Instead, the stories ended with them leaping into a pond together, where they were said to live out their days in harmony, croaking only for each other, as one 14th century storyteller wrote. You might think that's sad, that becoming a frog is some kind of downgrade. But in these stories, it's not. It's freedom. No titles, no taxes, no overbearing uncles arranging marriages for land. Just reeds rain, and a companion who listens with wide eyes and doesn't interrupt. Here's tonight's peculiar whisper from history, one chapel inscription, dated roughly to the late 1300s, features a carving of 2 frogs holding hands beneath a weeping willow, with the phrase, "They chose the leap." Local legend claimed the couple had been denied marriage by feuding families and vanished shortly after. Their cloaks were found near the pond. Their rings hung on a cattail. Since then, the pond's been known as the Lover's Leap, and no one builds near it. You stand now, gazing at the mirrored surface. A young couple approaches quietly behind you, holding hands. They speak softly, asking if the frogs are still here. You nod toward the 2 across the water. The girl smiles. They've been there every time we've come. The boy adds, I think they're watching over people like us. People who aren't supposed to work, but do anyway. They sit. No fanfare. Just presence. And somewhere in the reeds, a frog croaks, once low and deep like an old drum. Then another joins in, slightly off-key. Then silence again. Brief, comfortable. Let's take one last scholarly glance. These stories weren't just bedtime tales. They reflected medieval people's deep understanding of constraints, class, religion, family, duty. And sometimes love didn't get a happy ending with feasts and banners. Sometimes love got a pond and a second life under the stars, croaking in quiet defiance of a world that didn't understand. Back in the village, elders still tell the tale on certain festival nights. They say if you sit by the pond and see 2 frogs together, you must make a wish not for love to begin, but for it to end well. Because beginnings are easy, endings that stay soft, that leap together rather than apart. That's the real magic. You linger as the moon rises, painting the water silver. The frogs are still there, still side by side. No crown, no transformation, just a love that leapt and landed. 3 tender chuckles before your dreams begin. Some couples want castles, others just want a good pond and no interruptions. If they croak in sync, they're soulmates, or just very coordinated. Love tip: when in doubt, leap together, even if it means growing gills. Beyond the pond. A goodbye. The air feels heavier tonight. Not ominous, just full. Like the last page of a letter you didn't want to end, or the final bite of something warm you hoped would last one spoonful longer. You're back at the pond, but now the frogs are quiet. Not asleep. Just done singing for now. The moon is high and full, casting everything in silver trees, stones ripples. It even makes the moss look elegant, like nature threw on a velvet cloak for one last dance. You sit alone on the edge, boots damp with dew cloak, wrapped tight, and eyes searching the shallows. You know they're still here, somewhere beneath the surface. Not every frog needs to be seen to be heard. Tonight's historical fact at the end of harvest season: some medieval villages held farewell blessings at local ponds or wells, rituals marking the close of courtship festivals or seasonal love ceremonies. People would whisper into the water, offering thanks to the frogs, to nature, to anything that had helped a heart open even briefly. These weren't dramatic ceremonies, just soft goodbyes. Maybe a ribbon left on a reed. Maybe a quiet walk home without saying much at all. And here's tonight's peculiar final detail. In one old folktale, it's said that if you'd once fallen in love with help from a frog's croak and returned to that same pond years later, the frogs would recognize your footfall. They'd croak once, low and slow, and then stop, as if honoring the memory without interrupting your life's new chapter. You smile now, hearing that silence. It doesn't feel empty. It feels full of stories, of whispers and potions and half-believed dreams, of people who looked at frogs not with fear, but with a strange kind of hope. Because frogs were never just frogs in the Middle Ages. They were warnings, cures, confessions, omens, sidekicks, scapegoats, matchmakers, and yes, sometimes secret royalty in disguise. They lived in books, jars, slippers under beds, and in baskets. They were kissed, boiled, blessed, accused, named, blamed, and occasionally celebrated with alarming enthusiasm. And through it all, they remained themselves. Wet, blinking, slightly judgmental, perfect. You rise from your perch, brushing moss from your knees. Behind you, the trees rustle like a lullaby being folded up and put away. You walk slowly, not because you're sad, but because the night deserves it. The frogs don't sing as you leave. But one does leap just once, from rock to water, with a plunk that echoes like a final period at the end of a very old sentence. You don't turn around. You just smile. 3 farewell croaks for the road. The frogs will miss you, or they won't. But either way, they noticed. Leave the ribbon. Take the memory. Mind the mud. And if someday someone calls you a little frog-like, thank them. That's high praise now. So now, dear friend, as the frogs go still and the pond fades behind us, it's time to ease into sleep. Let the echoes of croaks and charms, whispers and wishes settle gently like mist across your thoughts. You've wandered through chapels and kitchens, courts and cauldrons, all for the humble amphibian who once leapt its way into medieval hearts. Maybe you didn't expect to find so much affection wrapped in warts, or so much magic in something that lives in mud. But that's the charm of history, isn't it? The way it hides tenderness in the oddest places, beneath lily pads, in herbal satchels, behind the eyes of a frog who might have once been someone brave or lonely or simply hopeful. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of candlelit stories soften your breath. Picture the quiet pond once more. Moonlight dappling the water reeds, swaying like gentle sighs, and two frogs side by side, not rushing, not hiding, just being, together. And remember, the Middle Ages weren't always battles and plagues. Sometimes they were just about love. Strange, sticky, wonderful love told in the language of croaks and glances and the occasional toad in a travel pouch. You don't need potions, or prophecies, or frogs in your bed. Just the comfort of knowing that someone somewhere once believed you could whisper your heart to a creature of the pond, and that it might, in its own way, whisper back. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.